The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. On today's show, we have Alan Ridgeway. Alan is co-founder and CEO of FloraWorks. FloraWorks are an innovative Canadian hemp refinement laboratory offering specialised cannabinoid formulations. That was a mouthful. Hey, Alan, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. About to go on summer holidays, so I'm excited.
That's great.
Yeah.
We're hoping to maybe get away and do some of the same kind of thing here in August.
Yeah, good. So we're here to talk about CBN, which is a topic we've not talked about before. And obviously FloraWorks are doing some great work with that cannabinoid. So we'll hear more about that in a minute. But I always obviously like to start with a bit of a background on yourself. You know, how did you get into the industry? What were you doing before, etc.?
Sure. And just let me start by saying thanks a lot for having me. Look forward to talking about CBN. It's a topic that we, hold near and dear to our hearts. But going back to what your question was, which is, what's my background? I started life as a scientist. I have a biochemistry degree from the University of Western Ontario here in Canada. I followed that up with a Ph.D. in biochemistry. And then after graduating, went down to Harvard Medical School, did a postdoctoral fellowship in the lab of Phil Leader, where we did cancer genetics research. Spent about 3.5, almost 4 years there before coming back to Canada to Queen's University, where I did an MBA. And on the back of doing that MBA, I landed on Bay Street in Toronto in the equity research group at the Royal Bank of Canada, covering Canadian healthcare.
Wow.
Canadian healthcare is an interesting sector in Canada because it's a very broad sector. You get to cover a large range of companies across various industries, from biotech, pharma, right through to labs, hospitals, medical devices, etc. So you get a really wide range of companies in your coverage universe. You get to see a lot of different business models and speak to a lot of diverse management teams, etc. So it was an interesting place to start. I covered healthcare for 15 years in Canada. I moved around a little bit. I went to a boutique called Paradigm Capital. Then I jumped over to Scotiabank and ultimately ended up at Sprott Capital Partners, where I covered the cannabis industry for 2 years before leaving to found FloraWorks.
Ah, okay. Well, that's quite a journey. I'm going to ask you a few questions. What made you make the was it a jump from sort of science and academia to Bay Street?
Yeah. So when I was in graduate school, I had 3 housemates. 2 of them were doing their MBAs, and both ended up being investment bankers. And so during that time, just sort of hanging out with them and hearing what they were doing, sort of got a bit of the business bug, which I think I'd always had, but I just didn't pursue in my undergraduate work. And so MBA was sort of always in the back of my mind. And then after spending, 2 to 3 years doing the postdoctoral fellowship research path, kind of realized that the white lab coat really probably wasn't something for me for the long term. Great respect for all my buddies who are still doing it, because it takes a very serious commitment and a lot of patience and a lot of real dedication to continue to push down that path.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't right with me.
Yeah.
So, started to think about what I could do. And, a couple of friends said to me, have you ever thought about equity research? Pharma, biotech would be a great fit for you. And so that's kind of what my idea was when I went back to do my MBA. And, luckily met the right people, had the right conversations, and got one of those jobs that you kind of fall into, I think, and then was able to sort of continue to move up or move down that path.
Yeah, great. And presumably the sector that you were covering you're still able to leverage your scientific background in that area. How did you find segueing from just general healthcare into cannabis? And how did you approach that? Were you cautious at the beginning? Were you like, what's going on here?
Yeah, so I I had left RBC in 2010 and I moved over to Paradigm Capital, as I mentioned earlier. And at Paradigm, we were a boutique in end of 2013, early 2014. The medical cannabis industry started to gain some momentum in Canada, and mid 2014, I might get my years wrong, but I believe that's right, is when Tweed and Metrum and Bedrocan went public, and Organigram was talking about or about to go public. And we were positioning at Paradigm to, potentially get into some of those syndicates and write research on that sector. And so I had started to do due diligence on those companies, and I had, been up to Smith Falls to see the original Tweed facility, and had been out east to see the Organigram guys, and had started to look at the sector. But around the same time, Scotiabank and I were having a conversation about me moving over there to cover healthcare at one of the big five banks. And, at the time, the cannabis sector was still very much medical focused. The recreational aspect of the Canadian market really was not even at play at that point. Justin Trudeau was not the head of the Liberal Party even yet. And so what happened over the next 4 years was not something we could foresee. And so I moved. And when I went over to Scotia, it was one of the big banks, and they were very cautious on the cannabis industry. So, wasn't able to cover the sector from there, but, kept an eye on it, still had contacts from the early days, and was able to sort of, think about what that business would look like. And then at the end of 2017, early 2018, Sprott Capital Partners, which is another small group, reached out to me, and we had a conversation about me potentially moving over. And that's when I jumped over to cover cannabis full time.
Great. And so how did you arrive at FloraWorks, or how did you start it?
Yeah, so the FloraWorks story really starts in the late summer, early fall of 2018, when the Farm Bill was starting to get, play in the media. And it really did look like the hemp language that was, drafted was going to get passed. And I started to speak to clients, and I started to write a little bit internally and selectively about the hemp market and what that would mean from an industry perspective. I really liked the fact that, that was much more like a consumer packaged good play, much more like a vitamin type wellness type play, where you didn't have your state by state regulations. You could build scale. You could do everything that quote unquote a normal consumer packaged good company would do. And so I really started to talk about the hemp space, and had a few investors who wanted to deploy capital into the hemp area in the US in particular approach me, and we had conversations about, what would be interesting, how would you want to position yourself. We looked at a few projects together and ultimately settled on the FloraWorks play, given a number of factors, which I'm sure we can dive into as we move forward into the conversation.
Yeah. And so what does FloraWorks do now?
Yeah, so FloraWorks is positioned, we call ourselves a refinement company. And what we really do is we sit downstream of the primary extraction of hemp biomass. So we do not extract ourselves. We take previously extracted, winterized crude, which is the typical starting point, and we refine out cannabinoid ingredient. And that's how we think of our business. We make cannabinoid ingredients for the health and wellness sector. And we go about it in a way that we think about those ingredients as the final product, and we want those ingredients to be as pure and consistent as possible so that we can move into products where we have absolute consistency, and we can really start to ask the kind of scientific and R&D questions around them as to what exactly are these individual cannabinoids do, what do the ratios of the cannabinoids do, and not have other molecules or other substances at play that may be affecting those results.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting that you define yourself as a refinement business. Presumably, even though you're not vertically integrated, your supply is very important, and choosing people that cultivating the right cultivars for you, assume, is a very important part of your process.
Yeah, one of the reasons that our operations are located in Oregon is given Oregon's both geographical positioning. It's a very, very good state for growing plants of any variety, in particular cannabis and hemp. And there's lots of hemp being grown in Oregon. There's lots of processing available, and there's no shortage of extract and oils in the market. In addition to that, though, we also have other supply partners that supply us with product that is great starting material. And so there's no lack of starting material for us.
That's great. That's great. Cool. Well, let's get on to the main topic of the show then, which is CBN, and which is an area that you guys are focusing on. Let's start with the really obvious question. What is CBN?
CBN is one of the 100 plus cannabinoids that are found in the cannabis and hemp plants. It's one of the main rare cannabinoids that most people speak about. And when they talk about broad spectrum, the main cannabinoids as we think of them at FloraWorks from the hemp plant are CBD, which is the major, and then the three minors, which would be CBG, CBC, and CBN. CBN has been known and been around for a long time. In cannabis, it was always thought of as the sleep cannabinoid, I think largely because it's present in old cannabis. And so it had a following that, old cannabis can make you sleepy. And I think that has sort of transferred over through the years, and that's sort of what the thinking is around the product. But what we've found now that we have it isolated at a very pure level is that it has a number of other attractive features as well. Structurally, it's very similar to THC. It forms in cannabis and hemp as a breakdown product of other cannabinoids, particularly THC. And so while it is structurally very similar, it has different properties than the other cannabinoids.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people would be familiar with it for being, as you say, as THC degrades into CBN. What are the kind of ailments that it's sort of being touted as being useful for?
Yeah, I think when we're talking to customers on our ingredients business, I think most of them are looking at putting out products aimed at sleep. But I also think that people are becoming more aware of its analgesic properties, and also in the feedback that we've gotten from people, helping with anxiety. So the three areas that we think are interesting from a CBN perspective are sleep, pain, and anxiety. And that's all based on anecdotal feedback from people that we have been able to sample product to over the last 4 to 5 months with our pure CBN, that we know is only CBN and nothing else in there to confuse the results that we're seeing.
Yeah. And is that in part, so when I was reading up a bit before the show, as you say, CBN's known as being quite sleepy, but actually in isolation, it's not necessarily, sedative. Maybe it's a combination with THC, and maybe it's a combination with terpenes, and which is probably why you did mention it in the three top things that you are targeting, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I think, one of the interesting areas is terpene research. And really, when you think about, that old school thinking of the old cannabis makes you sleepy, what are some of those terpenes converting into as the cannabis is aging as well? And is it really a combination of the terpenes and the cannabinoids? Whereas now that we have CBN isolated, what I would say is we consistently hear back from people, and this is all anecdotal. It's, nothing's been done yet in a randomized study or anything like that. But at this point, what we're hearing back anecdotally is that people tell us that they feel like they wake up more refreshed, or they feel like they slept better if they have taken some CBN. And so we do believe that it has benefits on that front. And then now I think where the research needs to go is, what does it look like if it's combined with THC or with CBD, or potentially with a different molecule that does have, sleep-inducing properties, whether it be a natural product like a valerian root or something along those lines, in combination that could be an excellent sleep product. And then, what we also hear back is the pain aspect, which is certainly interesting.
Yeah. And actually, you bringing that up. How does it fit in terms of a scale, in comparison to THC and CBD?
Yeah. So what we think is happening, and this is a hypothesis, and it needs to be tested and figured out and answered for sure. But what we think is happening is that CBN has a higher binding affinity for the CB2 receptor than it does for the CB1 receptor, whereas THC binds both of those receptors fairly equally. The other thing I would say is that CBN binds them not quite as strongly as THC does, at least from the in vitro studies that have been done on the receptors and the binding affinities of the different cannabinoids. And so if you were to come up with a hypothesis, our hypothesis is that CBN is binding the CB2 receptor more strongly than the CB1 receptor, which allows you to get the benefits of that receptor from the chin down without getting the high. So when you have pain relieving properties of THC from the chin down, those pain relieving properties are being stimulated by the CB2 receptor. We can hit that receptor without the high associated with the CB1 receptor.
Wow, that is a potentially huge development, right? Because, a major issue that people have with the pain aspect is that, they don't necessarily want to get high or get the effects, the intoxication effects from THC. So if you can, minimize those and maximize the pain relief, that's kind of ideal, right?
Exactly. And we've spoken to people about that exact situation. And, what we are hearing back from people is that this is what they're feeling. They're feeling the pain relief with a clear head. And so that is where we think the CBN could go. And as I said before, we're very interested in testing this and proving this out and working, with our partners and our customers to really drive the CBN market forward and figure out some of these answers.
Yeah, fascinating. And so, in the UK, CBN is actually a controlled substance, and I assume the lawmakers are probably, because they're petrified of THC, they assume there's something wrong with it because it's degraded THC, let's say, on a very simplified level. What's the legal state? I assume it's not the issue in Canada and in some of the states.
Yeah, so Canada and the US are very different. Canada it's a cannabinoid. It's regulated by the Cannabis Act. And so you need to be an LP, a licensed producer, to sell CBN. Same with CBD in Canada. Very different than the US or even, I believe, the UK, where you can walk into a pharmacy or a health food store or whatever and buy it off the shelf. You can't do that in Canada. So in Canada, we would be regulated by the Cannabis Act. Currently, we're not operating in Canada. Our operations are in the US. We're in Oregon. And so in Oregon, we fall under the Farm Bill because everything we do is hemp derived. So under the Farm Bill, by definition, the cannabinoids that are derived from the hemp plant, as long as the plant meets the definition of hemp, our CBN is a hemp derived cannabinoid and is legal across the 50 states.
Right. Okay, that's quite a difference.
It's a very big difference, and it's one of the reasons that drew us into this business with FloraWorks. And as I started with talking about, how the Farm Bill sort of affected my thinking and the thinking that we had around the business in general of hemp and with CBN. Not that we knew that all these properties were going to jump out at us. We originally jumped on this because of the sleep aspect, and I think some of the other things are just good luck, to be honest. But it's the legal definition of hemp that allows us to sell it across state lines.
Right. Very interesting. So, but I guess, the US is big enough as a first market to deal with anyway, right? It's before you start to think about international. So
yeah, if we never left the US, the market is more than big enough to be, an extremely successful company. So yeah, Canada is a very interesting market for us. It's where I live. It's where a lot of our investors are. We would love to do something in Canada, and I think we will eventually. But right now our focus is on the US and moving quickly to get people interested in CBN.
Yeah. Fantastic. So what are the main challenges with it? I assume research is probably the main one, right?
I think there's two things. I think research in general, because it just hasn't been available. So, you're not going to be able to log online and find a lot of really good scientific evidence of CBN doing much. It just hasn't been studied beyond, in vitro binding assays and some other things. There's a few studies out there, but it's very limited when you compare it to like a CBD or a THC. Even a THC at this point has much more published data. The other one is just awareness. One of the downsides of the whole nomenclature of the cannabinoid world is CBN, CBD, CBC, CBG. The average consumer still, I don't believe, really differentiates between the different CB, whatever the ending third letter is. And so we often get asked, we'll hand out CBN samples to friends and family, and they'll come back and say, can I get more of that CBD? And so just a general awareness, I think, is one. And then absolutely the research side. And we're a bunch of scientists. We're very research driven. And so we want to do all of that work, and we want to answer those questions. And so it's just going to take time.
Yeah. With many aspects of this industry. So yeah, I mean, so FloraWorks? So what are you guys doing? What are the applications you're doing? And products rather? Is it vaporization, or is it tinctures? What's the sort of what things are selling more than others?
Yeah. So at this point, we are an ingredient company. So we are currently selling our CBN isolate to other companies who are, for the most part, still in the formulation stage. Looking back on our history, just to give a bit of a timeline, we really started this company on January the 1st. And so, yeah, we acquired a hemp handler business in Oregon on December 31st. And that business had started to work on CBN, but was doing, some small scale research. They had some small scale equipment on hand. They could make CBN, but we've refined that process and scaled it up. And so we're now capable. We built a pilot facility within the facility that we're in, with the idea that if demand works out as we hope it does, we'll be able to expand internally. But we can currently make about 100 kilograms a month of CBN. And we were really at that scale mid-March. So of course, as we went out to start selling this in mid-March, late March, the world was hit by COVID, and all things changed for about 8 to 10 weeks.
Yeah.
And so we, continued to do things internally to refine our process and to build out some inventory and do that kind of stuff. But it was a very slow move until mid-May, early June, when we started to really have conversations with people again about, hey, you guys have CBN? Oh, that's interesting. Okay, let me think about what we can do with it. Can we buy a small sample to do some R&D with? And so that's sort of the phase that we're working through now. And we'll see. I think most customers are working on, clearly tinctures. There's some edibles, gummies, candies. There are some groups that are working on some vaporizer products. At FloraWorks ourselves, we do plan to launch our own branded products. It's going to be under the brand called Right Wellness. And we're initially going to come out with a tincture and some gel caps.
Yeah, fantastic.
It can be vaporized. It's an interesting product. It's very relaxing. Again, it's sort of chin down relaxing. It doesn't have the head high.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a product that we're interested in, but it's not a priority for us. We think that the tincture and the gel caps as a wellness company is the place to go first.
Yeah, probably a good starting point. Okay, cool. So, as we get towards the end, is it a kind of exclusive focus on CBN? And maybe that's defined by, at the moment it is, but you're looking at other things. And then maybe also development in that. What are your general thoughts around the entourage effect and incorporating other cannabinoids and terpenes into whatever you're doing?
Yeah, I think originally CBN was the attractiveness, because the team that we work, that we've assembled had experience and was starting down that path. It's also a cannabinoid that you can't get to by breeding the plant. There there isn't going to be a high CBN plant that's driven by an enzyme in the plant itself. Whereas CBG and CBC and clearly CBD, you can get from the plant. That being said, we're very interested in all four of those cannabinoids. And we're very interested in understanding the interplay between the four of them. Traditionally on the hemp side, a broad spectrum distillate would be high CBD with low levels of CBG, CBC, and CBN. What we're interested in doing is producing broad spectrum distillate with those four molecules, but being able to do it in a customized way with very accurate dosing of each of them. So whether you want an 85-555 or a 90-333, we can mix and match based on the cannabinoids that we have in house. The other thing by doing it the way that we're looking to do this is we can ensure that there's zero THC. And so for people that are concerned about accumulation of THC in their system, whether that be for, just ethical or health or even, testing fear reasons, we can ensure that we have a broad spectrum distillate that contains the four different cannabinoids that has zero THC. And so we're working with all four, but CBN is our calling card at this point. And so that's the one that we're really pushing for ourselves.
Yeah. And presumably terpenes are going to factor into that as well at some point?
Yeah, terpenes are interesting. Terpenes, I believe, definitely have an effect on the entourage play that people have, historically spoken about and believe very much in. I do believe that some of these terpenes are important for some of the effects that people feel. Whether or not those terpenes need to be hemp derived or if they can come from other sources is an interesting question. To get into the hemp derived terpene game, you need to be at a different point in the production cycle or the production process than we are. You need to be, at the biomass stage where you can capture those terpenes before they're really boiled off. There are some terps available in the products that we're starting with, but I think for most people who are looking to do sort of like a full spectrum terpene mix, you need to start with the biomass as well and just capture them the whole way through, right from drying through, the primary extraction to, your distillations later on.
Yeah. Well, I think the four cannabinoids would be probably enough for you to keep you busy for a while.
Yeah. When you start to look at how you might go about investigating what they do in combination, the combinations get out of hand pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. But it must be really exciting for you as a scientist to sort of get your hands dirty with all of this stuff.
Absolutely. Definitely. We're super excited to do a bunch of this work.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you, Alan. That's been great and really good to hear about CBN. Obviously in Europe it's not as open as what you're doing in the States, but really useful to understand more about it, and hopefully positive research into it that shows efficacy in various areas will hopefully speed things on this side of the pond too.
Absolutely. I think as people generate more and more data with all of these cannabinoids, I think we're going to ultimately reach a point where, we'll be able to lobby governments or regulators and say, we'd like to bring CBN into this market for this purpose. And, even if that's a highly medical market where, physicians are involved and prescriptions are involved, if we have the data that says this is beneficial for, ailment 1, 2, 3, it could be beneficial and be a great market. So, we're hoping to get there someday. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, cool. Okay, well, thank you, Alan, for joining me today. And that's really interesting. And it'd be great to have you on again at some point to hear how you guys are getting on.
Love to come back. Thanks.
Cool. Cheers, Alan. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks for joining me for that. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did enjoy it, please hit subscribe on whichever podcast platform you use. I'd also love a nice 5-star review on iTunes if you have the time. You can also follow the Cannabis Conversation page on LinkedIn and also sign up to my mailing list via cannabis-conversation.com. Until next week, have a good one.